Before continuing, I just want to remind the honourable members that the SO31s are 60 seconds. Not much more, not much less, 60 seconds. And I wouldn't want to cut any of them off. So j'aimerais demander à tous les députés.
So I'd like to ask all members to be careful to not go beyond the 60 seconds because it is something that is very important for each of us and for our ridings. I just wanted to remind you of that.
Questions, question orale, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
En ajoutant,
by adding more to our national debt than all other prime ministers in the history of Canada put together, this prime minister has added $500 billion in inflationary deficit, which is increasing the cost of products and services we purchase. Now, the finance minister admitted that she wants to increase the taxes on EI by $2.5 billion. That will take even more money away from workers' wages. Mr. Speaker, will the government scrap those tax hikes so that workers can keep more money in their pockets? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, it appears that the Conservatives now get it that we need to help Canadians to help fight the effect of inflation. Better late than never. So I appreciate the latest Conservative flip-flop. It's about time they also supported our one-time payment of $500 to help vulnerable Canadians who are having a hard time paying their rent. It's never too late to do what needs to be done, even for Conservatives. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Raise taxes on the working poor, and yet that is exactly what the minister admits she will do. She admits that raising the EI premiums, the EI payroll taxes, will take $2.5 billion extra dollars out of the hands of Canadian workers, and not to fund EI. She also admits through her own public filings that the government will take $10 billion more in EI taxes than it will pay out in benefits, money that the Prime Minister will raid from the account and spend however he likes. Will the Prime Minister get his hands off the EI fund and the paychecks of our workers?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the EI contribution rate today is 1.58. Next year, it'll go up to $1.63. Both of those rates are lower than the EI contribution rate was in every single year when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister. Yet the new Conservative leader, who was actually the employment minister during those years, now wants to slash our contributions. So who do the Conservatives think was the better economic manager, Prime Minister Harper or their new leader?
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, we were terrific economic managers together, and we will be again. So I'm just getting a little practice in on answering questions, Mr. Speaker. We'll be doing more of it when we're in government soon. But in fact, EI payments have gone up for the average $60,000 a year worker from $930 when I was the minister to $948 now. That's a small increase, but the big $2.5 billion tax increase is just ahead. This minister admits the money won't even go to EI. It'll go to government spending. Why won't they get their hands off the EI fund and the paychecks of our workers?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Speaker, in 2015, a Canadian earning $49,500 a year paid $931 in EI premiums. Next year, that same Canadian will pay $807. That's nearly $125 less than she paid when the Conservative leader was the minister in charge.
Wow.
So, yet again, Mr. Speaker, Canadians really need to understand whose policies do Conservatives support, Stephen Harper's or their new leaders?
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
And both. And the total payroll tax of a $60,000 a year earner went from $3,400 under the previous Conservative government to $4,168 today. And the reality is, none of that was necessary, and they want to use the money for anything but EI. Mr. Speaker, on top of that, now they plan to triple the carbon tax, raising gas, heat, and grocery costs and killing jobs for many people in many sectors. Their policy is paychecks down and costs up. And in fairness, they're succeeding at both. Will they stop that policy and cancel their tax hikes?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've already explained that Canadians earning around $50,000 a year next year will pay $125 less in EI premiums. But now I want Conservatives to come clean on what they want to do to our pensions. Their proposal is an irresponsible scheme to eviscerate our pensions. As Rob Carrick pointed out, quote, Canada Pension Plan premiums are not a tax. The CPP is the bedrock of a Canadian retirement plan. The Conservatives want to undermine all of our pensions, but we won't let them.
The Leader of the Opposition.
That is absolutely false. Conservatives protected the CPP, increased benefits for seniors every single year we were in office, and did it without any tax increases at all. We can do that again. Everybody agrees we should keep contributing. Nobody agrees that we have to hike taxes on workers to do it. But back to the carbon tax. They want to triple this tax on groceries, gas, and heat at a time when Canadians can barely afford to pay their bills. They want to add 40 cents a litre to gas taxes right now with 40-year high inflation. Will the government cancel this tax on Canadian energy?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let's get serious. Canadians know this Conservative leader does not have a serious climate plan, and that means he doesn't have a serious economic plan. The economic reality is our most important trading partners, the U.S., the EU, our customers, our markets, are all taking aggressive climate action. Canada cannot afford to fall behind. Our economy cannot afford it.
The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, according to Radio-Canada, the federal government is turning Roxham Road into a permanent facility, and it's already cost us at least $500 million. The feds have signed contracts until at least 2027. Hotels, land, trailer rentals, etc. This is all a done deal until 2027 minimum. That's why they're not suspending the Safe Third Country Agreement. That's why they're not cracking down on criminal people smugglers. They want it to last. They like it. Mr. Speaker, making Roxham Road permanent is in whose interests exactly? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we believe in the strength of our asylum system and our immigration system. We work closely with stakeholders on the issues at our borders, and we work with our U.S. counterparts on questions related to our common border, including the Safe Third Country Agreement. We will always work very closely with our partners. Thank you. The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you who has an interest in making Roxham Road permanent. Criminals who traffic in people. Criminals who see families in despair and think there's a buck to be made there. And Liberal donors who get government contracts. They're all laughing to death, Mr. Speaker. They know Roxham Road won't close for at least 5 years and maybe never. Thanks to the federal government, they can turn their little racket into a booming industry. Why is the government giving them business instead of thinking of the welfare of migrants and closing down Roxham Road for good? The Right Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, once again, I'd like to underscore the fact that we believe in the strength of our asylum system and our immigration system, and we are working with our U.S. counterparts on all issues related to our shared border, including the Safe Third Country Agreement. And I'd like to say to our colleagues, the members of the Bloc, that we can and we must work together on immigration because it's an economic issue for Quebec and all of Canada. The honourable member for Burnaby South.
From Halifax earlier today about the devastation of Hurricane Fiona impacting the Atlantic region, how so many people lost power and so many people lost cell services. In fact, many people lost cell services because telecommunication companies aren't putting in place the right infrastructure to be prepared for extreme weather. So when will this government force those companies who are fully regulated by the federal government to put in place the necessary infrastructure so families don't get disconnected ever again?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me start by saying directly to every single Canadian who has been hard hit by Fiona, we are with you and we will be with you to the end until we finish rebuilding your homes and your communities. The Canadian Armed Forces are on the ground in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia and on Prince Edward Island. And when it comes to cell service, that is absolutely a priority for Canadians in good times and during disasters. And that's why we are working hard with the cell phone companies to ensure they give Canadians the service they need.
The honourable member for Burnaby South. Because of climate change, extreme incidents will be more and more commonplace. So it's clear, the experts are clear on this. If telecommunications companies do not put the right infrastructure in place, people will continue to lose their cell service. Why doesn't this government force those companies to do what's necessary so that people don't lose their cell service in the future? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. On behalf of the government, I'd like to begin by reassuring all Canadians affected by Fiona that as a government, we're doing everything we can to ensure that everyone affected by the storm will get what they need. The Canadian Armed Forces are on the ground in Nova Scotia, Newfoundland and Labrador, and PEI. We obviously understand the importance of cell service, and we are also working with companies to ensure that Canadians get that service.
Colchester.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the wine industry in Cumberland Colchester is dominated by Yost Vineyards. In recent conversations, it is clear that Hurricane Fiona has had a significant and profound negative impact. Almost 20% of the crop is now on the ground, and they only have the ability to process 25% of the crop due to a lack of electricity. What specific and targeted programs will this government have to support the industry in its time of need?
The Honourable Minister for Intergovernmental Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I thank our colleague from Cumberland Colchester for the question. As he knows, the Prime Minister is currently in Nova Scotia and visiting Prince Edward Island today as well. I have had very constructive and positive conversations with Premier Houston and the other Atlantic premiers. And Mr. Speaker, we can be very clear. The Government of Canada will be there to support not only the residents of the area that were hard hit, but to work with provinces as well to ensure that the economic engines of those provinces, like the industry, the agricultural industry that my colleague referenced, are also supported fully by the Government of Canada.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland Colchester.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Yost Vineyards and other farmers in Atlantic Canada need more than platitudes from this government. They need action. That's right. The other thing we need action on, Mr. Speaker, is the cell phone service. We've already heard about this in this question period, but we also know that from the member from Charlottetown last evening, he reiterated that cell phone service is essential for the safety of Canadians and that the system failed again. The government knew after Hurricane Dorian 3 years ago that the system was tenuous at best, and once again, this government has failed to act. Atlantic Canadians need a concrete plan to ensure a reliable cellular service. What is the outline for this government for this plan?
L'honorable secrétaire parlementaire.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, we know that the cell network is essential, and with Hurricane Fiona, we've seen this, and we're doing everything we can as a government to restore service. We're working with the provinces, and we are there, we're going to do everything we can to restore all necessary services to Canadians affected by this storm.
Or St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If a tornado tore up the 401 in Toronto, the government would already be repairing it. This government is not even in the communities assessing the wharf damage from the hurricane. How do I know? Because fishing organizations are out there, but no one from DFO is. Wow. This will require new programs or we cannot earn a living. Will the minister commit that new programs to repair wharfs will be 100% financed by DFO, since port authorities do not have the financial resources to do this?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries and Oceans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I just want to also express my just the shock at having seen the images in Atlantic Canada and Eastern Quebec, and my thoughts are with the families still struggling in those areas. I'd like to assure the member that DFO has already inspected 80 small craft harbors. We're on the ground. We're there for Canadians. We're there for fish harvesters, and we are committed to rebuilding and renewing this infrastructure so that they can do their jobs out in the fisheries.
Well, member for South Shore, St. Margaret's.
Since the hurricane, I've been speaking every day with fishermen and fishing organizations about the damage caused by the hurricanes and the needs of the industry to recover. As I said, it's clear that we need some new programs to deal with this. 4 days since the hurricane, and the minister is yet to call a single fishing organization in Atlantic Canada. How do I know this? Because I talk to them every day and she doesn't. How will the minister design new programs that respond quickly if she does not talk to the fishing organizations and the people most impacted?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, having chatted with MPs and ministers from that area, I am very much seized with how much challenge this is for people who have lost their homes. They may have lost their boats, their fishing gear, and there may not be adequate food in the grocery stores. So we are there, DFO, our staff, the Canadian Coast Guard, the Canadian Coast Guard College, and we were doing everything we can on the ground to support the people of Atlantic Canada and Eastern Quebec, and we'll continue to do just that. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Miramichi Grand Lake.
Mr. Speaker, if the minister or her department had bothered to reach out to fishing groups about hurricane damage, she would know that lost gear from lobster fishermen in New Brunswick and PEI is over 50%. The season has 3 weeks left. Without traps, they cannot fish, and the need for support to replace these traps is immediate. Will the minister commit to immediate emergency support to replace this equipment, to finish out the season, and into what should be our proposed extended season?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries and Oceans.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate these voices of concern from the members opposite, and I can tell you the members on this side of the House from Atlantic Canada and Eastern Quebec have been on the ground. I've spoken with my parliamentary secretary. He hasn't slept for days, and I've heard about the devastation that people are experiencing. We are, and I am in touch with fish harvesters, provincial ministers, caucus members, and we will be happy to hear what requests there are for extensions and consider them very seriously.
The Honourable Member for Montmagny-Lillet, Kamouraska, Rivière-du-Loup. Mr. Speaker, now that Hurricane Fiona has blown through, hitting the Magdalen Islands hard, it's time for action. The extremely violent winds and rain left their mark. Buildings sunken, roads impassable, ports and boats destroyed. I know the people of the Magdalen Islands are resilient and they're helping each other in an admirable way. Will the government ensure that quick and easy help will be available to those who need it? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, the answer is yes. The Government of Canada will always be there to rebuild the infrastructure under our jurisdiction, and we will be more present than ever. We're going to work with the fisheries industries, with the provinces, and with the municipalities to ensure that we go further and that we rebuild the community infrastructure, public infrastructure, that's essential to those communities, including in the Magdalen Islands and all throughout Atlantic Canada. The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, the feds could close Roxham Road tomorrow morning if they wanted to by suspending the Safe Third Country Agreement, but that's not what they chose. According to Radio-Canada, they've chosen to make Roxham Road permanent. All the deals have been signed to keep Roxham Road open until at least 2027. Mr. Speaker, making Roxham Road permanent also means making permanent the criminal smuggling networks that get rich off the desperation of migrant families. Does the minister realize the smugglers are popping champagne today, paid for with migrants' money? The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, that's precisely why we're working very closely with the Government of Quebec. Our investments to strengthen the integrity of our borders and to ensure that those who abuse the system are brought to justice. So we're working with Quebec and the U.S. to ensure that our asylum system remains fair, equitable, and transparent. The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, every time the minister claims he's protecting refugees, but he's letting them get exploited by criminals and extorted and lied to, because the criminals don't tell them they've only got a 50% chance of being successful and of not being deported at the end of the process. The minister is protecting criminals, not refugees. We believe protecting migrants means allowing them to come through the front door at border crossings safely and without abuse. Why is the minister choosing Roxham Road and the smugglers' racket instead? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, we shouldn't suppose that each person entering at Roxham Road is a criminal. That's wrong, what the Bloc is saying. There are refugees who contribute. And what does he say to my honourable colleague from Dollard, who entered through Roxham Road and now is a very strong voice for their community? The Bloc should stop saying things like this, and we should be investing in our asylum system. Thank you. That's evidence that they really don't know what they're talking about. Other than the smugglers, the only winners from the choice to make Roxham Road permanent are those who get federal contracts. We know Roxham Road has already cost at least $500 million. We don't know the exact amount because the federal government refuses to disclose all its contracts. This is worrisome because among the contracts known to exist are 7 that were awarded without a call for tenders to the companies of 2 well-known Liberal donors. It sure pays to be Liberal, doesn't it? Will the government disclose all the contracts, all the amounts, and all its suppliers? The Honourable Minister.
To the member opposite for his question. Transparency and accountability are critically important to our government. And what we have done in terms of the Roxham Road situation is that we are delivering open, fair, transparent procurement processes while continuing to obtain the best value for Canadians. And of course, divulging confidential contract information would violate the agreement we have with the supplier. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Haldimand, Norfolk.
Mr. Speaker, life has become increasingly unaffordable for Canadians because of the Liberal taxes and skyrocketing cost of living. The average Canadian family now spends 43% of their income on taxes, which is more than they spend on food, shelter, and housing combined. A quarter of Canadians are even taking extreme measures of cutting back on food. Will the government end their planned tax increases on gas, home heating, and groceries and have some compassion for suffering Canadians?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we know that times are tough for Canadians. That's why we've put forward a fiscally responsible plan to support them. And here's some good news. Conservatives are starting to get on board with our plan. They announced on Sunday that they are supporting the GST tax credit. That's going to give up to $500 to hardworking Canadian families. It's time for the Conservatives to understand there's a lot of Canadians who need help paying the rent. The $500 one-time payment will help them. I hope the Conservatives will see the light on this great policy too.
The Honourable Member for Haldimand, Norfolk.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians cannot afford to pay for this government's reckless inflationary spending and deficits. This government's planned tax hikes will drive up the cost of living, will affect rural Canadians, low-income families, and vulnerable populations the most. This government is out of touch with the struggles of everyday Canadians. So I ask my question again. Will the government end their planned tax increases on gas, home heating, and groceries?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, a couple of times today, we've heard the Conservatives talking about deficits, debt, and fiscal responsibility. Now, I would say that's a bit rich, coming from a party whose leader actually had the temerity to advise Canadians to invest in Bitcoin, which would have eviscerated their savings. But I do want to set the record straight on fiscal responsibility. Canada has the lowest deficit in the G7. We have the lowest debt to GDP in the G7, and we have a AAA rated credit rating.
The Honourable Member for Haliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock.
Speaker, on average, a Canadian family now spends more of its income on taxes at 43% than it does on necessities, such as food, shelter, and clothing, which combined amount to 35%. Families are growing increasingly desperate as they stretch out their paychecks to fight inflation, a weakening dollar, and out-of-control tax increases by this government. When will the Prime Minister listen to their pleas, take action to cap spending, and cancel their planned tax increases on gas, home heating, and groceries?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to remind the Conservatives of something Canadians understand very, very well. CPP and EI contributions are how all Canadians set money aside for our retirement and create a safety net in case we lose our jobs. At a time of global economic uncertainty, I have to say it is the height of irresponsibility, almost as bad as suggesting investments in crypto, for the Conservatives to be arguing that we should not be making these essential fiscally responsible contributions.
The Honourable Member for Bellechasse, Les Etchemins, Lévis. Good morning, Mr. Speaker. The price of basic grocery staples is skyrocketing. For example, bread and bakery prices have gone up by 16% in just a year. Butter is 26% more expensive. A pound of butter now costs $8.29, Mr. Speaker. Thousands of families in Quebec can't make ends meet. Instead of helping them, the Prime Minister is making life more expensive for those families. There's only one thing he can do to help them, Mr. Speaker. That's to cancel his planned tax hikes. Can we count on him to cancel them? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, contributions to EI and to CPP allow us to create a social safety net for every Canadian and make sure that we can afford our retirements. In this time of global economic uncertainty, it's completely irresponsible for the Conservatives to suggest that our country should stop setting money aside for retirements and for rainy days. Maybe they just want to cut Canadians' pensions.
For Victoria.
Mr. Speaker, Big Oil has been making record profits off the backs of Canadians who are struggling, all while refusing to clean up their climate mess. The Environment Minister says he's not opposed to a windfall tax, but he's waiting to see if Big Oil will invest in climate action on their own. Instead, they're paying out huge dividends to their shareholders and bonuses to their rich CEOs. If the minister is waiting for Big Oil to do the right thing, he's going to be waiting a long time. Time is running out for our planet. Will the Liberals tackle corporate greed, implement a windfall tax, and make Big Oil pay their fair share?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Environment.
Speaker, I couldn't agree with the Honourable Member more. Energy companies are doing well, and they must put their shoulders to the wheel and invest in reducing pollution. But, Mr. Speaker, we're working on many fronts to reduce fossil fuel emissions. We're going to cap emissions from the oil and gas sector. We're going to be introducing a clean fuel standard. We're putting a price on pollution, and we're going to be eliminating inefficient fossil fuel subsidies in 2023, 2 years ahead of schedule. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Rosemont-La Petite Patrie. Mr. Speaker, if the Liberals agree, well, they just have to do it. They just have to have the courage to go after the big oil companies. Mr. Speaker, price of groceries is skyrocketing while CEOs are lining their pockets with record profits. Last year, the CEO of Sobeys took home over $8 million, but instead of giving employees a raise or lowering prices, he took away their bonuses. It's shockingly shameful. The NDP is calling on a parliamentary committee to study the greed of companies that continue to raise grocery prices for Canadians. Does the government think it's okay that rich CEOs continue to make millions on the backs of Canadian and Quebec families? The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we have been and continue to be completely determined to ensure that everyone pays their fair share in taxes. We are increasing in a permanent way taxes on the richest companies by 1.5%. And we have introduced a relaunched dividend, a dividend of 15% on excess profits from the COVID pandemic. That's action.
Tense.
Mr. Speaker, Hurricane Fiona has had a devastating impact across Atlantic Canada, particularly in communities in northern Nova Scotia, Cape Breton, Prince Edward Island, and western Newfoundland. Now, the government has committed to making sure that we are part of that rebuilding process of communities, and we're working with the Canadian Red Cross to match private contributions. But it is extremely important to make sure that we have support on the ground for helping with the cleanup and to restore electricity to those that need the help. Can the Minister of Defence, who is originally from Atlantic Canada and knows our communities well, provide an update to this House on the work of the Canadian Armed Forces to help support Atlantic Canadians in their time of need?
The Honourable Minister of Defence.
Mr. Speaker, as a Nova Scotian myself, I want to assure my honourable colleague and everyone in this House that the Canadian Armed Forces will be there for as long as needed. In Nova Scotia, the Canadian Armed Forces are removing debris and restoring roadways and bridges. In Prince Edward Island, the Canadian Armed Forces are assisting with restoring the power grid. And in Newfoundland, they're going door to door to check on their neighbours to make sure everyone is okay. Mr. Speaker, from the bottom of my heart, I'd like to thank the Canadian Armed Forces for all they do to keep Canadians safe in this time of need.
Great work. The Honourable Member for Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, the weather is getting cool and people are starting to turn on the heat. Millions of Canadians rely on oil and propane to heat their homes. The cost of those fuels, however, has skyrocketed. It now costs upwards of $5,000, $6,000, or even $7,000 a winter to heat their home. And now the government has put on top of that a carbon tax that will cost upwards of $400 or $500 a winter. People are getting desperate. Will the government listen, including to the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, and cut the tax on oil and propane heat?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
As we watch yet another disaster unfold that is fueled by global climate change, as the world is called to act on climate change, playing games with misrepresenting climate action, when the member well knows that the money that is taken is given back to Canadians and that the action that is taken is essential so that we have less Fionas, that we have less disasters and less Canadians that are affected by global climate change. We have to take action, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Wellington, Halton Hills.
Mr. Speaker, that government is completely out of touch. Emissions have risen each and every year that this government has been in power, except for the year of the pandemic when they shut everything down. A third of Atlantic Canadians heat with oil heat. Over 1 million Ontarians, 10% of Canadian households. When will this government do what other G7 governments have done and provide relief on fuel taxes and cut the tax on oil and propane heat that people are so desperate to use this winter?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment. I believe the honourable member for Wellington Halton Hills would like to hear the answer to that. The honourable parliamentary secretary to the Minister of the Environment.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as our House Leader said, it's absolutely astounding on a week where climate change has ravaged much of Atlantic Canada. The opposition wants to take a valuable tool off the table that is helping to reduce emissions and put more money in people's pockets. And be sure that, Mr. Speaker, we will be there to help Atlantic Canadians rebuild. And, Mr. Speaker, we will be there to help them transition from carbon-intensive fuels to greener energy. Mr. Speaker, we will be there for Atlantic Canadians.
The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Mr. Speaker, economists agree that payroll taxes, like the increases the government is pushing on Canadians, are the most regressive form of taxation because they lead to lower productivity and jobs leaving Canada. That's not stopping this government from jamming these taxes onto Canadian workers. Inflation is eroding Canadians' ability to buy the basics, and the government is gouging more of their take-home pay. Canadians get to feel the pain of this government's reckless policies at both ends. Will the government cancel their planned tax increase on Canadians' paychecks?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Actually, Mr. Speaker, what Canadians need is for Conservatives to come clean with them on their plan to eviscerate our pension system. Their scheme is highly irresponsible. And you know who pointed it out this week? Rob Carrick of the Globe and Mail. He wrote, quote, "Canada pension plan premiums are not a tax. The CPP is the bedrock of a Canadian retirement plan. The Conservatives want to undermine the pensions all Canadians depend on. We won't let them do that, Mr. Speaker." Exactly.
We started off really well, and suddenly I'm not sure what happened. So, I just want to remind. I want to remind all the members. I want to remind all the members to look at their whips and follow their instructions. The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Well, Mr. Speaker, in the last decade, payroll contributions under this government have risen by 13% for employment insurance and over 60% for CPP. And the last year has seen the effects of massive government overspending showing up in inflation numbers Canadians haven't seen in 40 years. Workers' paychecks aren't going as far. Now there will be even less in those paychecks. Given the harsh rise in the cost of living for Canadians, will the minister take heed and cancel the tax increase on Canadians' paychecks?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what I will do is tell Canadians the truth about what is happening with their EI contributions and their pensions. And what is true, Mr. Speaker, is that in 2015, a Canadian who earned $49,500 paid $931 in EI premiums. And you know how much that same Canadian will pay next year? $807. That's $125 less than she paid when the Conservative leader was the employment minister. That is supporting hardworking Canadians.
The honourable member for Montcalm. Mr. Speaker, throughout the pandemic, the Prime Minister repeated to Quebec and the provinces that he was ready to discuss an increase in health transfers, but only once the crisis had passed. Well, yesterday, the federal government ended all of its remaining COVID restrictions. Now it's time to fix healthcare. There's nothing in the way of fixing the other major public health crisis, the federal government's chronic underfunding of the public health care system. The question is simple. When will the Prime Minister convene a summit on increases to the health transfer? The Honourable Minister of Health. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very happy to hear this question from my colleague. It gives me the opportunity to say that, once again, next week I will be speaking with all of my health minister counterparts to say that I am ready to help them invest in dealing with the problems that we have around delays, surgeries, and diagnostics. We know that there's an accumulated effect of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we are ready to help with that. We need to make sure that Canadians have access to home care, palliative care, long-term care, and Canadians know this is important for Canada and for Quebecers. The Honourable Member for Montcalm. Well, Mr. Speaker, the government says that it spent a lot of money during the pandemic, timely investments during the pandemic, but that won't fix any of the long-standing problems. The federal government needs to pay its fair share for health care. That's what will shorten the wait list. That's what will allow us to hire more nurses so that we can end mandatory overtime. That's what will allow us to train and hire psychologists for the public network. When will this government understand that the future of public universal health care depends on a $28 billion increase in transfers that are indexed at 6%? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my colleague is right. The federal government did invest $73 billion in health care for Canadians throughout the pandemic, and that continues with vaccines which are still being sent to provinces with rapid texts, with the Paxlovid medication. As you know, Paxlovid is now available to the provinces and territories to help Canadians who are dealing with severe health issues related to the COVID-19 pandemic. We've also invested in personal protective equipment and many other things for the provinces and territories.
London. Mr. Speaker, under this government, the cost of living is skyrocketing. But don't fret. This government has an affordability plan. The same government that got Canadian families into this affordability crisis. The truth, Mr. Speaker, families are spending more of their income on taxes rather than on food, shelter, and clothing combined. That is 43% of their income on taxes and just 35% on essentials. Mr. Speaker, will the government end their planned tax increases on gas, home heating, and groceries?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we understand that conservatives have seen the light when it comes to our plan to support Canadians with the cost of living. They kicked and they hollered at the beginning of this parliamentary session, but over the weekend they did a very conservative flip-flop, and they said, you know what, we're going to support the GST tax credit. They did the right thing, Mr. Speaker. I hope that this weekend we'll see them supporting another important measure, the $500 payment to support Canadians with the cost of housing.
Member for Bow River.
The average Canadian family now spends more of its income on taxes than it does on the necessities of food and shelter combined. Farmers in Bow River are paying millions in carbon taxes annually just to power their irrigation systems. Their hard-earned dollars are being siphoned off by the NDP Liberal government rather than being reinvested in local economies, local infrastructure, local goods. Will the government end their planned tax increases on gas, home heating, groceries, so farmers can get back to feeding the world, so Canadians can afford nutritious food?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague for his question. As he knows, on-farm fuel for farmers are exempt, and as he would remember as well, through the fall economic statement last year, we provided a carbon tax rebate for farmers, which they are eligible for this year, which is based on farm expenses. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Signal Hill.
Mr. Speaker, this Liberal government takes more out of a working Canadian's paycheck for taxes than is left to take home to pay for groceries, pay the mortgage, that's if they can afford to home, and to put gas in their vehicle. That's not right, Mr. Speaker. This Prime Minister is out of touch, but he's got an opportunity. And through you, Mr. Speaker, I ask this Prime Minister, can he promise to this House today no more tax on Canadians?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Conservatives seem to think Canadians aren't smart. But I know that Canadians are really smart. And I know Canadians are responsible. And I know that Canadians understand the value of the Canada Pension Plan. Canadians understand the importance of saving in the Canada Pension Plan. And that's why Canadians see right through these Conservatives who are irresponsibly suggesting we eviscerate the CPP. But no surprise, they told Canadians to invest in crypto.
Hear, hear.
The honourable member for Pontiac. Mr. Speaker, it was so difficult to watch throughout the weekend all of the destruction caused by Hurricane Fiona. And this is a very serious example of the climate crisis that we are all facing today, here and in our communities. Can the Minister of National Revenue please give us some concrete examples of this new reality? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague from Pontiac for her important question. Mr. Speaker, because of terrible storms like Fiona, we're no longer talking about climate change, but instead we're talking about a climate crisis. One of my constituents in the Magdalen Islands said that she'd never seen the ocean swell like that before. And she said that after seeing a storm like that, it's impossible not to believe in climate change. The truth, Mr. Speaker, is that the climate crisis is real and we need to act. And what do the Conservatives not understand? Will they wake up and realize that we're in a climate crisis, Mr. Speaker? The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, in January 2017, the Prime Minister invited the entire world to move to Canada through the Roxham Road crossing. But this invitation from the PM has created some very lucrative opportunities for his Liberal buddies. CBC Radio-Canada reported today that at least $500 million have been spent managing the Roxham Road and Lacull crossings. And for example, he awarded single-source contracts worth no less than $14 million to his friend Pierre Gay, someone who, by sheer coincidence, has contributed over $16,000 to the Liberal Party. Why do so many contracts awarded by this Prime Minister have a whiff of corruption? Can the Prime Minister explain?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite for the question. As I said before, transparency and accountability are critically important to our government. The rental agreement reference was negotiated based on a fair market value to arrive at a competitive price. Given the location of the land and its proximity to the border, this was an ideal location for CBSA to use for this purpose. Our government is delivering open, fair and transparent procurement processes while obtaining the best value for Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, I've been there 3 times over the last 5 years in Lacull, and every time we saw that there was completely useless spending, great tent setups that were emptying, spending that served no purpose. And the worst in all this, Mr. Speaker, is that the contracts have been given to friends. They're contracts where we can't see the details, we don't get the information, and because they're saying it's a national security. You know, what's a national security about just a tent? Mr. Speaker, listen, I'm really proud of the question that my colleague has asked because it gives the opportunity to talk about what we're doing, the agreements that we're working with. And I think earlier the member from the Bloc Québécois made this reference, and let me be very clear. Our system for asylum seekers must be strong. There's no magic solution. And I know that they say we should suspend it. Well, suspending the Safe Third Country Agreement would do the opposite of making things safe. We need to modernize the agreement, and that's what we're doing, working with the United States.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Today, the Liberals have falsely claimed that the immigration system is both fair and delivering value for money. I think the 2.4 million people languishing in the longest immigration backlog in Canadian history will be enraged by these talking points. This includes the family of Ayad, a 12-year-old torture survivor who's currently huddled alone in a refugee camp. Will the Liberals explain to Ayad's family how spending $500,000 to make it easier for people to skip the line in upstate New York at Roxham Road is both fair and delivering value for money?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
So, Mr. Speaker, I want to talk about some of the investment that we're making. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? I have to say, we have taken measures to reduce the wait time.
We're doing more to tackle the backlog of the short term while making our system more sustainable in the long term. We're doing this by hiring 1,250 more staff. Mr. Speaker, we understand the value of immigration, and we will continue to be there in protecting our immigration system while continuing to invest to make sure that people who can come to Canada come as quickly as possible.
The Honourable Member for Pierrefonds-Dollard.
Monsieur le Président, according to the United Nations, the world is going through a global food crisis caused by war, climate change, and the COVID-19 pandemic. Canada, with its international partners like the World Food Programme, has worked tirelessly to combat food insecurity. Mr. David Beasley, the Executive Director of the World Food Programme, has been championing this cause during his ongoing visit to Canada. Monsieur le Président, le ministre du Développement...
Mr. Speaker, can the Minister of International Development please tell us how Canadian is working with its partners in the World Food Programme to fight global food insecurity? The Honourable Minister.
We'd like to thank the Honourable Member for this question. The climate crisis is causing a food security crisis for the most vulnerable around the world. Mr. Speaker, hunger leads to conflict. This is why Canada was the fourth largest single country donor to the World Food Programme in 2021, providing over $306 million in humanitarian funding for emergency food and nutrition assistance to people in need. And I want to take this opportunity to thank the members of the World Food Programme and the many other organizations for feeding the most vulnerable on our planet. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Nunavut.
Families across Canada are struggling with food prices. Grocery costs are even worse in Nunavut. CEOs of big grocery stores get millions of dollars in bonuses, while families in the north are unable to access affordable, fresh food. This government refuses to listen to Inuit and fix the Nutrition North program. When will this government step up and finally implement a windfall tax on grocery stores making record profits and help Nunavut milk access the nutritious and affordable food they deserve?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question, and I'd like to say that in Inuvik, approximately a month ago, we announced an expanded Nutrition North program with $164 million in new funding in partnership with Indigenous partners. The newly expanded program moves beyond simply a subsidy with a new Community Food Programs Fund to directly support community-led food security activities, and we are providing more funds directly to Indigenous partners through the Harvesters Support Grant, increasing access to traditional country foods through hunting, harvesting, and food sharing. Thank you.
Well, member for Vancouver East.
An Inuit woman who traveled to Ottawa to be a nurse died after just 4 days in the city. She was a victim of violence who had no access to safe, affordable housing. The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry final report cites housing 299 times. The minister was asked about it today, and he said, quote, "Words fail me." His words and inaction are failing Indigenous, Inuit, and Métis people. Will the minister ensure that is meaningful investments in a for Indigenous, by Indigenous, urban, rural, and northern housing strategy in Budget 2023?
The Honourable Minister.
I want to extend my appreciation to the Honourable Member for the really important question. And the case that she is referring to obviously touches all of us. When a member of our community is targeted and doesn't have access to safe and affordable housing and is on the street, it diminishes all of us, Mr. Speaker. We are committed to a for Indigenous, by Indigenous, urban, rural, and northern housing strategy. That is why in Budget 2022 we've dedicated $300 million as the first installment of what is needed, and which is a significant amount of money and investments that are needed to put in place serious investments in a for Indigenous, by Indigenous, urban, rural, and northern housing strategy.
C'est tout le temps que nous avons aujourd'hui, Mrs. Zor. Si je peux avoir deux...
If I may have two questions before a call to order.
The presence in the gallery of the Honourable Ashni K. Singh, Senior Minister of the Office of the President with responsibility for finance of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana.